Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. As World War I progressed, it originally started out without the United States making a significant effort. But when the United States came in, we got to go take credit for the victory. The Yanks are coming. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have three objectives today. By the end of this class today, you should be able to describe the contribution of the United States to the Great War. You should be able to examine U.S. civilian life during the war, and you should be able to assess the way in which the war affected race relations in the United States. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 14. So Russia gets into the war as part of the Entente side. They are the rats of the great big fat rats of Great Britain, France, and Russia. But at some point in Russia's history, they have a revolution where Tsar Nicholas II, who got into World War I and poorly led it, was overthrown in the Bolshevik Revolution. As Russia then is replaced with the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the first things that new transitional government does is withdraw Russia from World War I. So tired Russian and German soldiers, they were at war just a few days earlier in November of 1917, gathered to shake hands and walk away, basically went quitsies onto the war. In response then, Germany is no longer fighting a true front battle. They no longer have France on one side and Russia on the other. You'll remember in the Schlieffen Plan that the original plan was that to conquer France and to hold Russia until France was beat and then put everything into the Russian side. It turns out that while France was harder to take than they thought, Russia fell pretty easily for reasons that were unrelated to, at least immediately, the part of the Schlieffen Plan. So by May of 1918, Germany then, having put all of their effort onto the Western Front, was within 50 miles of Paris. After 2.5 years of fighting, Allied troops in Europe, that's the Entente side, they were exhausted and demoralized. German law, now the Germans were having a hard time there also. The German law required that if a person was going to go to war, they needed to be at least 19 years old. That was the letter of the law. But in practice, they were enlisting boys as young as 14 years old to go take battle and to march into arms. Which, if you think about the First World War, was fought at least partially by high school freshmen. That's point B. American troops, though, when they arrive in, they brought new soldiers, but more importantly, brought freshness and enthusiasm, having not been carrying the burden of a 2.5-year war of essentially attrition or a stalemate. General John J. Pershing, whom we met in our previous unit as the general who was chasing Pancho Villa around northern Mexico, General John J. Pershing led the American Expeditionary Force into Europe. Officially, the American Army is known as the Expeditionary Force. Unofficially, they're known as the Doughboys. The Doughboys, it's a little unclear how they got their name, probably because of a cleaning agent they would use that was sort of like a dough and would carry it around. But the American troops were working way beyond their experience. You got to remember, the United States was not a cosmopolitan country, especially then. Most Americans were farmers back home, and they were impressed with the great cities of Europe. They were, though, shocked by the battle itself, just the horrors of the battle, and also its modern weapons. Americans, though, helped stop the German advance just in time, and they pushed back the German offensive through the months of July and August. By September, the tide had turned against the Central Powers. Subpoint C. Now, how did the United States Navy contribute to this battle? Well, it was the development of a convoy system. The convoy system are destroyer ships who escorted merchant ships. So merchant ships are just like sailing boats with goods and stuff on them, not military ships. But they have a military export which will sail along next to them across the Atlantic, and that did successfully cut losses. The United States Navy also helped lay sea mines across the North Sea, keeping U-boats out of the Atlantic. Sea mines are a real thing, so if you've seen Finding Nemo and you're like, oh, the party balloons, that's actually sea mines, and they're a real thing. And the United States Navy mined the Northern Atlantic to keep U-boats out of there as well. By 1918, Germans were losing so many ships, they were having a hard time replacing the boats and the trained submariners as a result of that increased naval battle from the United States, Roman numeral number 15. Let us turn our eyes homeward and see what's happening on the home front. A lot of women were taking jobs in heavy industry, which had previously been held by men. Women were becoming railroad workers and cooks and dock workers and bricklayers. They mined coal and built ships. Some were active also in the peace movement. I think this is hard to overstate, notably Jeanette Rankin of Montana. Now, Jeanette Rankin of Montana was the first female member of the United States House of Representatives. So it may surprise some people to think that Montana, which you don't usually think of as a progressive, forward-thinking part of the world, but they were the first ones to elect a woman to Congress. But in 1918, she runs for her first re-election and loses. And she loses because while it's typical for women to have a pacifist stance, the voters weren't going that way. And so her opposition to World War I made it politically unviable. She lost election in 1918. But the fury of civic activity really did bolster the support for women's suffrage. So women don't have, they're not acknowledged the right to vote by this time, but women were out volunteering in the war effort. They were serving in Red Cross facilities and planting victory gardens and selling war bonds and supporting the war effort. The National Women's Party was militantly fighting for suffrage. The NWP was led by Alice Paul, and the party pressed for the right to vote, for militant tactics in order to get older suffrage advocates. Now, and it's worth noting that Alice Paul is leading kind of the guerrilla war side of women's suffrage. She's a very confrontational tactics that Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt, they just couldn't relate to it. They actually thought it was pretty scandalous, some of the stuff that Alice Paul was doing, that she would go and be willing to protest until she got arrested. And while she was in jail would, lead hunger strikes to stay relevant and stay in the newspapers. She often compared Woodrow Wilson to Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of the German Second Reich. And her supporters went and, chained themselves to the White House fence, for which they got arrested for. The combined efforts of women during the war, though, won them suffrage. It was the militant policies by Alice Paul and the National Women's Policy. It was also the, just civic activism of women supporting the war with selling war bonds and working in the Red Cross. And those two wings made it really clear that you just could not continue to deny women the right to vote. The combined effort won them suffrage, and the 19th Amendment passed Congress in 1919. It was ratified in 1920, subpoint B. Now, a lot of impulses, there were numerous impulses were flowing into a renewed campaign to go ban intoxicating liquor. Like the suffragists, prohibitionists saw legislation as their best strategy. That the way that to go get alcohol outlawed was to outlaw it itself, not just make it socially unacceptable. Employers were big fans of prohibition. Actually, workplaces supported the idea because they believed that a sober, cleaner labor force would be a better labor force and be more reliable workers. Urban reformers, so city-based reformers, were also strongly likely to be prohibitionists as well, believing that it would make cities more orderly and also to limit the political organizing which took place in the saloons. A lot of the city machines, the machine politics that were operating in the cities, their vehicle of doing that was the bars in urban areas. Women reformers hoped prohibition would go protect families against domestic abuse and wasted money. And native-born Protestants thought it would Americanize the otherwise, seemingly drunk Catholic immigrants that were coming into the town. And the 18th Amendment banning alcohol was ratified in 1919 and went into effect by 1920. I shouldn't say it banned alcohol. That's not strictly speaking what the Prohibition Amendment did. It banned the production, the sale, and the transport of alcohol. But if a family had alcohol, they could drink it. They just couldn't serve it to somebody else or sell it or take it out of the house or anything. But yeah, prohibition. Subpoint C. Now here I want to talk about a very kind of a classic Eric Foner topic, and it's the question of liberty in wartime. Woodrow Wilson conceded that leading the nation into war was a fearful thing, and the conflict did usher in the most extensive repression of civil liberties in the nation's history. And maybe a classic example of this is the Espionage Act of 1917, which prohibited not only spying and interfering with the draft, but also making false statements regarding the draft. Things that might impede even military success, saying things that were unpopular, could hurt the army, could be a crime under the Espionage Act of 1917. It was the first time the federal government had enacted laws to restrict freedom of speech since the John Adams administration of the Alien Sedition Act since 1789. The post office, using the power of the Espionage Act, banned newspapers and magazines that were critical of the Wilson administration. And any newspapers that were critical of the draft itself was seen as, just really dangerous for the country, and they were also blocked. More than 2,000 people were charged with interference over the war effort, and of those, half of them were convicted. Most notably, our old friend Eugene V. Debs, the sometimes presidential candidate and most important socialist in American history. He was convicted in 1918 under the Espionage Act for delivering an anti-war speech. Debs then, in 1920, ran for president from jail. He wasn't successful, but he did get almost 1 million votes, a little over 900,000 votes. It was the Espionage Act that took Emma Goldman jailed and then ultimately deported. She was a Russian immigrant. Emma Goldman, we've kind of mentioned her a couple of times before. She was in Period 6. The person that killed Garfield was trying to impress Emma Goldman to do so. She was an anarchist, and that just wasn't acceptable under the Espionage Act during World War I, and she was deported. Attitudes towards the American flag became a curious test of patriotism. Like, the flag itself seemed to have some intrinsic value. And people suspected of disloyalty, of not being American enough, were often forced to go kiss the flag in public. And any criticism of the flag could get a person jailed. Anybody that would possess a flag which was symbolic of communism or anarchism, they could face criminal charges in 33 American states. The American Protective League, known as the APL, even helped the Justice Department identify radicals and critics of the war. They had nearly 250,000 members who were spying on their neighbors and carrying out what they called slacker raids, where they stopped men on the streets and demanded to see their draft cards to make sure they had registered for the draft. Roman numeral number 16. This one will title, Who is an American? Subpoint A. The use of the German language and expression of German culture became a target for pro-war organizations. So, in total support of World War I, anybody that seemed to Germany was saying, that's just not American. And so Americans with German last names often found themselves with their ability to provide for their families left, because they were losing their jobs because their last name was a German last name. Orchestras refused to play work by Mozart and Bach and Beethoven and Brahms. And if you know much about classical music, that is a pretty significant part of the catalog that goes missing. Schools stopped teaching German language classes, and librarians were removing German-authored books from the shelves. Even the German measles, which today we know as rubella, were nicknamed the Liberty measles. And honestly, I don't know why they would if you're trying to vilify Germans, then leave measles named after them. But anyway, we started calling it Liberty measles, I don't know, for freedom. Today we just refer to it as rubella. But the hamburgers, Hamburg is a city in Germany which invented the hamburger. We think of it as American food. Americans love their hamburgers. They actually stopped calling it hamburger and referred to it as Salisbury steaks. Salisbury's in England, and it just sounded more patriotic. Anyway, dachshund, the little wiener dogs. They used to have a dachshund. They're fun and kind of an awful animal. Whatever, we used to have a dachshund, but dachshund is a German dog that actually means badger hound. You can't have a German named dog. So they started calling them Liberty pups. What a great dog this would be. Anyway, if you have hot dogs, the classic name for a hot dog is a Frankfurter, and Frankfurt is a city in Germany that developed that type of sausage. But no, now they're called hot dogs because you got to purge yourself of all the Germanness. Subpoint B. The war also strengthened the conviction that there were certain kinds of undesirable persons that ought to be just excluded from America altogether. New immigrants were accused of valuing democracy less than what they were the Anglo-Saxon race, explaining why immigrants were more likely to be socialists or anarchists just because they just don't love democracy like the rest of us do. The IQ test was actually introduced in 1916, and it was immediately put to use in the military. It seemed to prove that black people just weren't as smart as white people. And it was used to support, limiting immigration from inferior countries. Now, today, there's a lot of people that are pretty skeptical of the IQ test just in general, but a lot of work has been put into it to make it culturally neutral. It certainly was not culturally neutral in 1916. Subpoint C. Here I want to talk about Teddy Roosevelt, who is no longer president and is not actually all that culturally important during World War II. Woodrow Wilson, who is the current president, and how his cultural importance, and then the question of race. Teddy Roosevelt had invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him at the White House. Now, we've met Booker T. Washington before. He's the founder of the Tuskegee Institute. He's the moderate reformer towards African American rights, and he's the first black man to get invited to the White House in the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt, by today's standards, we would not consider him to be a racial progressive, but he did work to diffuse racial tensions between black and white Americans and hope for a steady, if slow and if passive approach, but a steady approach in improvement of the rights of African Americans. Woodrow Wilson takes office after Taft, though, and is totally the opposite on this. Woodrow Wilson imposed racial segregation in federal departments in Washington, D.C. While Roosevelt and Taft were desegregating the federal government, old Wilson resegregates it again. He fired black officials that Roosevelt had deported. He even screened D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of the Nation, in the White House. The Birth of a Nation is a romanticized story of the founding of the Ku Klux Klan. It said it should be required viewing in every high school in America. The Birth of a Nation is not historically accurate. It wasn't even supposed to be at its time. It was a romanticized story talking about, oh, what would be so noble of the KKK and, restoring civility and awesomeness to America. And Wilson's like, boy, this is a great movie. Everybody ought to see it. Subpoint D. The W.E.B. Du Bois, sometimes seen as the Booker T. Washington opposite. I don't think that's totally fair, but sometimes that's the way he's characterized. W.E.B. Du Bois tried to reconcile the contradiction between what he called the American freedom for white people and the continuing subjugation of Negroes. His book, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903, claimed that the talented 10th, the most elite 10% of African Americans, should use education and training to go on to go challenge inequality. In some ways, W.B. Du Bois was a typical progressive that believed that investigation and exposure and education would lead to civil rights solutions to social problems. He co-founded an organization known as the Niagara Movement, a black civil rights organization named for the mighty current of change that he hoped to affect one day. Like Niagara Falls itself, the movement sought to reinvigorate the abolitionist tradition as well, saying that abolitionism, while slavery is no longer allowed in the United States, the Jim Crow laws of the oppression are, and that also needs to be overturned as well. W.E.B. Du Bois was the co-founder of the NAACP and was seen as the intellectual opposite of Booker T. Washington. It's not a totally fair characterization, but that's sometimes the way we remember him. Subpoint E. The war also opened up thousands of industrial jobs to black laborers for the first time, inspiring a large-scale migration from south to north. And it's like one of the first times there's a significant movement of black people from the southern part of America to the north, and they're in search of better jobs and better opportunities and maybe escaping some of the old bonds and traditions of the South that are holding them back. But there, 500,000 African Americans found jobs, but also just a different form of racism. It turns out while the North, while it doesn't have a tradition of slavery, it does, have an old-fashioned tradition of American racism to it. But it does change the lot of life for African Americans, and because World War I is a transitional event, not just for African Americans, not just for women, not just for urban folks, but for everyone on the margins or the mainstream, and a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.